Sales tactic known as throwing spaghetti at the wall, where the salesperson suggests an outrageously high price for something he's selling just to see if it sticks. More often than not, the price is dead on arrival. It's intended to be. That's part of the trick. You see, the element of the shock allows the salesperson to create the illusion of a spectacular discount by slashing the initially artificially high price. The customer then leaves feeling like they've stumbled onto an incredible deal, too good to pass up, even though they left with a product they either didn't want or couldn't afford, or at a minimum, a product for which they paid too high a price. When I read President Biden's budget request, it felt more like I was trapped at a kiosk in the middle of the mall, or being sold a used car by a predatory, unscrupulous salesman, not reading a serious budget proposal from the President of the United States. So I'd suggest the President try again, because the spaghetti didn't stick. We're not buying what the President's selling, and his budget is dead on arrival. When the President reached the end of his sales pitch, he told us the price, a whopping $6.9 trillion. It would create a $1.8 trillion deficit in the first year alone. Then by 2027, we would break the record for the most debt held by the public as a percentage of U.S. GDP since World War II. Utahns are already pinching pennies as a result of this approach to budgeting. In August, I stood where I stand now, as this body was on the cusp of passing the $1.7 trillion omnibus package, and read letters I had received from Utah constituents. They explained how difficult life has become under Biden's record-breaking inflation. They described the daily choices they were forced to make because of how expensive life had become under this administration. Jenny from Salt Lake City wrote, quote, "My annual income is about $30,000 a year. I'm panicking. The price of groceries and other goods has increased so much, I'm struggling financially. I understand my utility bills could double or even triple. I don't know how I can afford to live." Since Democrats started their reckless spending 2 years ago, prices have risen more than 15%. Groceries are up nearly 20%. Kevin from Murray, Utah wrote, quote, "This morning I filled up my work truck. It cost $149. I'm a small business owner, and the price of fuel is a major challenge for our company of 5 vehicles traveling to our various projects." President Biden's energy policies caused gas prices to reach $5 and energy costs to skyrocket. Gas is up 45%, and Biden's budget will crush American energy with $31 billion in new taxes. I said during that speech that if the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results, then spending more money and increasing taxes to reduce inflation certainly meets that definition. This approach is insane, and the President is doubling and then tripling down. Rather than address the spending driving inflation, the Biden administration continues to blame inflation on everything from the pandemic to Putin. We know why. The President won't address inflation because he wants to spend even more. He wants to create the biggest government we've ever had and make it more and more expensive. Look, we've got to get this monkey off our back. But that can't be done in darkness. That has to be done while acknowledging the problem that we have and addressing it head on, not obscuring it. I want to be clear that the Constitution tasks Congress with determining annual spending and revenue levels, not the President's annual budget proposal. And clearly, this is for good reason. We have a constitutional duty here to protect our constituents from the snake oil salesman hell-bent on taking the American people for all they're worth. We'll leave the American people with junk they don't need and a payment they can't afford. Thank you. quorum call be suspended.
Without objection, the senator is recognized.
Mr. President, the song Freebird by Leonard Skinner became an anthem for those consumed by wanderlust. The music speaks to freedom, the right to explore and experience the world, and a simple truth that we're all connected. However, on October 25th, 2021, the right to explore and experience the world was put on hold for many when the White House issued a proclamation suspending and limiting air travel by unvaccinated foreign travelers. This mandate levies a particularly heavy cost on state and local economies and American relationships. Continuing this mandate at a time when President Biden himself declared that the pandemic is over is unjustified, and it ignores the new risk calculus that is affording Americans a renewed sense of normalcy. You see, Americans are ready to move on. And in fact, in many instances, they are moving on, and yet many are kept from doing so because of this policy and others like it. Right now, foreign travelers, including family members, friends, business relationships, and even international sports stars, are being kept off U.S. soil due to this draconian vaccine mandate. Mr. President, there are too many places we've got to see. But if we stay here with this vaccine mandate, things just couldn't be the same. So in the spirit of freedom, in the spirit of self-determination and sanity, I am here today to try to pass this, to try to seek to pass by unanimous consent the Freebird Act, which will restore the right to explore and experience the world by allowing non-immigrant, non-citizen travelers to be vaccinated only if they choose to do so. Because this policy has separated loved ones for too long. It's time to end the COVID-19 vaccination requirement for foreign visitors, prohibit using federal funds to carry out this requirement, and prevent the CDC from ordering future COVID-19 vaccine mandates for foreign travelers. It's just costing too much. Now, in 2021 alone, Mr. President, Utah visitors spent nearly $11 billion visiting our great state, generating over 130,000 jobs and almost $2 billion in state and local tax revenue alone. A significant portion of that involves foreign travel. But international visitation rates are still lagging. By lifting this vaccine mandate, Utah and the United States stand to benefit from increased international travel. Our travel and tourism industry in the state of Utah dipped substantially after the pandemic hit us. It hit us hard. Fortunately, it's recovered very nicely, but it's never recovered in the international travel sector to where it should be now, due in significant part to this particular mandate. It's not right. And it's not just costing us tourism. It's costing us meaningful connections that enrich and promote our shared humanity. Right now, 22-time Grand Slam champion and top tennis competitor Novak Djokovic is missing the ongoing Miami Open due to the foreign traveler vaccine mandate, still in effect, regrettably, in the United States. He recently missed the Masters tournament in Indian Wells, California, for the same reason. The U.S. Tennis Association, which does not impose COVID-19 restrictions of its own, expressed its hope that the policy will end. This is an excellent example of how the U.S. and Americans in general miss out on relationships, business, and recreational opportunities. The U.S. is missing the action while Djokovic continues to play in countries that have ended their vaccine mandates, including in Monaco, Bosnia, and France. It's affecting his standing in world tennis competition. Just as importantly, it's affecting Americans' standing with the rest of the world. Perhaps some think that the joke is on Djokovic. The joke is not on Djokovic. The joke is on us, on the United States of America. If we leave this senseless, meaningless policy in place that does no good, it accomplishes nothing, but it inflicts great harm at the same time. Right now, we have the opportunity, a great opportunity, a prime opportunity to reverse course. Today, we can join the rest of the world, restore our personal and business relationships, boost our tourism, and re-engage in the competitive spirit that brings nations together. It's time, Mr. President, to end this mandate. It's time to be free as a bird. And so, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 14, H.R. 185. Further, that the Lee substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, that the bill as amended be considered, read a third time, and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Senator from Vermont.
Reserving the right to object. Mr. President. Thank you. Mr. President, first of all, I'm largely sympathetic to the intent of this. I think all of us are exhausted by COVID. Fortunately, we're really coming out of it. It's been exhausting. So I'm ultimately hopeful that the administration, when this public health emergency is ended, which we expect will be very, very soon, the vaccine mandate will go with it. Secondly, I'm a big fan of Leonard Skinner, so that's a pretty persuasive argument, but I don't regard him as infallible. Third, Vermont is a tourist state as well. Our skin's a little tougher for, tougher folks. You got that soft powder out there in Utah, but tourism really matters to us. So the concerns that the senator from Utah is expressing, I'm sympathetic with. Let me state the reason for my objection. This public health emergency is going to end. The administration is actively, day in and day out, in the process of taking the steps that are going to unwind this. My view is that this is an area where executive responsibility has to be carried out in an orderly way, not just to address this question of ending the vaccine mandate, but there are other matters that are affected if this public health emergency is abruptly ended that may do harm to Vermont. And let me just be very specific. The telehealth provisions that were in legislation that allowed us to get access to health care should not end when the public health emergency ends. The necessity of trying to make some adjustment for premium assistance for folks who were able to get access to health care, and it's really made a difference for people in Vermont. I don't want them to just go off the cliff. So these are all separate and distinct issues. But if we have a process where each legislator picks out an area within the public health emergency that he or she believes should be taken out, you're taking away the capacity for an orderly transition from the public health emergency to the post-COVID non-public health emergency. So as sympathetic as I am to the points that the senator from Utah makes, including about the vaccine at this point, because of my concern about the collateral consequences of stripping the administration in effect of a capacity to have that orderly unwinding, I object.
Madam President?
The objection is heard. Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I appreciate the thoughtful words from my friend and colleague, the senator from Vermont. Enjoy working with him on the Judiciary Committee and always appreciate his insights and the thoughtful, respectful manner in which he communicates his message. I do think it's significant to point out a couple of things in response to those arguments. I think it's unfortunate. We had an opportunity to end this today. And by ending it, we could open up travel and tourism in a way that we haven't been. We could join the ranks of civilized nations of the world who have seen what a barbaric piece of nonsense this sort of restriction is. And we could do it right now. Now, my friend and colleague from Vermont points out that it's important to remember that the public health emergency associated with the COVID-19 pandemic is set to come to an end. I assume he's referring to the May 11th deadline in which we're expecting for it to come to an end. I welcome that. Look forward to that coming to an end. It's right for it to come to an end. One must ask, however, why must we wait until then to bring it to an end? President Biden has now long acknowledged that the emergent nature of the pandemic is itself over, is itself past. But even if we weren't, and I understand and respect concerns about not wanting to do things too abruptly that might affect, for example, telehealth. That's very important. That's why it's very important for me to point out here there's absolutely nothing in this bill that would affect in any way the practice of telehealth. Not directly, not indirectly, nothing. There is zero language in this amendment that would in any way affect telehealth. Nor is there anything in here that would affect the other programs, any of them that he mentioned. Not one thing. This is laser focused on a single point of entry restriction on foreign visitors to the United States. That's it. Nothing else is affected by it. So if what we're saying is we can't end any of this before we end all of the public health emergency, that makes no sense. It also makes no sense because as far as we can tell, there is absolutely nothing about the international travel restriction attached to this particular mandate that is tied to the public health emergency for the COVID-19 pandemic. Nothing. They are not tied together. So there's no reason at all for us to not pass this today, right now, at this moment. Look, this is past the House of Representatives. We could make this law. We could make this law of the land by the end of the day today. The American people would be much better off for it. Who will be better off as a result of keeping it? It's a legitimate question to ask. Who benefits from this? I struggle to imagine who really benefits from it. Now, maybe one or two federal bureaucrats save face over it because they put it in place. Perhaps they've got some pride of authorship with it. They don't want it to end. Well, I hate to break it to them. They're not lawmakers. They don't have the job of making law. We do. So if this stays on the book, again, joke's on us. Joke's not on Djokovic, it's on us. So I really am trying to understand why we would want to wait until May 11th or any other date on which the federal pandemic emergency would come to an end. It makes no sense. To the degree that this involves an argument that I've heard time and time again when addressing COVID issues from several of our colleagues, that we've got to defer to the experts, defer to the science used by the experts in our federal executive branch agencies. I would ask this: do you mean the same experts who told us that this virus came from bats and told anyone who doubted the idea that it came from bats that they were horrible people aimed at genocide or something? Do you mean the same experts that told the American people they couldn't let their little kids go to school? Do you mean the same experts who told America that they had to mask their 2-year-olds, apparently unaware of the fact that 2-year-olds don't respond fairly well to that? It makes me wonder whether any of those people have ever raised or even been around an actual 2-year-old. Do you mean the same experts who told us that masks would make all the difference, and that if you were masked, you would live, if you were unmasked, you would die? Do you mean the same experts who told us that if we got the vaccine, we would not get or be able to spread COVID-19? I can speak for personal experience. Having had COVID, then got vaccinated, then got it again, it didn't have that effect. And I know there are millions and millions of people like me who are in the same boat. Do you mean the same experts who continue to this day to insist that everyone else follow the restrictions imposed by those experts who were not elected by the American people, not accountable to anyone who is elected by the American people. Madam President, we've reached an epidemic in this country, an epidemic in which we've got government being run by experts. Experts are great. I'm glad we have access to them. They are not lawmakers. My copy of the Constitution, in the very first operative provision, the first article, the first section, the first clause of the Constitution, says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives, making clear that if you want to make a federal law, you must go through Congress, not through an expert in some executive branch agency. Article 1, Section 7 then makes clear how that happens. You can make a federal law only if you pass something through the House and the same language through the Senate, and then present it to the President for signature, veto, or acquiescence. If you don't follow that formula, you don't have a federal law. Tragically, since the mid-1930s, we've been on a bad trajectory, a bad course, a bad idea conceived and held by the devil himself, in which we have started delegating out lawmaking powers. We hereby declare that we shall have good law in Area X, and we hereby commit and delegate to Commission Y the power to make and interpret and enforce and adjudicate laws, rules carrying the force of generally applicable federal law. Make it so. The power to make laws, to be a lawmaker, is distinct from the power to make lawmakers. We are given by the Constitution and the people who elected us the power to do the former, not the latter. We make laws, not lawmakers. The only way these things were put in force to begin with was because we have excessively delegated our lawmaking powers. Shame on us for doing that. It's remained in effect because the federal court system, in my view, while occasionally stepping in, has been a little too lax, a little too reluctant to push back when we delegate our lawmaking power, which is itself a non-delegable duty. Shame on them for doing that. But shame on us again for the fact that when we act, we delegate to somebody, somebody puts in place a ridiculous, indefensible set of policies, policies that would never pass this body, never become law here or in the House of Representatives. Why? Because they're stupid, they're silly, they're ridiculous, they're counterproductive. A policy that we would never enact, and if we were stupid enough to enact it, we would promptly repeal it. When it gets put in place by an unelected, unaccountable bureaucrat using a stretched, distorted version of statutory text, delegating them some other power, that we have to sit there and take it. The American people who we serve, who hired us to make laws, have to sit there and take it. And we pretend, sorry, there's nothing we can do. We've got to wait till the experts end this problem that they themselves created. Madam President, this has got to stop. I'm not going away. This issue isn't going away. I don't want to wait until May 11th. I don't want to wait until those bureaucrats pull their heads out of wherever their heads happen to be at the moment. This is not going away, and I will be back. Thank you, Madam President. Mr. President, we're abdicating our constitutional duty. Sometimes we do this when we delegate lawmaking power to the executive branch. Sometimes we do this when we shirk in our responsibility to declare war. Today, I want to focus on the latter. By passing my amendment, we have the opportunity to ensure that all Americans have a voice in matters of war and peace. For decades, presidents of both parties have used authorizations for the use of military force to conduct military operations without meaningful oversight or accountability to Congress. The founders jealously guarded war powers and the power to authorize military force. They understood what it meant to be subjected to an executive with unfettered military authority. And indeed, this is one of the essential distinguishing characteristics between our system of government and that of England. Prior to the American Revolution, our founders became very familiar with the British system, under which one person, the monarch, could take the entire country to war. It was up to Parliament at that point to fund it and up to the people to fight it. But one person could take the country to war. The founders understood this, and they understood that unchecked and unaccountable wielding of military force is, in fact, the stuff of monarchs, of dictators and tyrants, which is exactly why the founders entrusted this authority only to the people's representatives, in the branch of the federal government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals. Throughout history, when kings waged war, it was the people who fought and died. One of the many things that makes our system of government unique was this principle our founders enshrined into our Constitution that gave every American a voice when they were faced with the prospect of sending their sons and daughters to war. Unfortunately, we've strayed from our founding principles. My amendment, which can pass today, is a recognition that we as elected representatives have a duty, an obligation, to reclaim the authority to declare war that rightfully belongs to the American people. My amendment does precisely that. It implements a 2-year sunset for all future authorizations for the use of military force, absent renewal by Congress. In no way would my amendment hinder military planning or weaken our national security posture. To the contrary, it would induce a proactive approach rooted in the present day and time. It would reaffirm our resolve and strengthen our military planning. It would show that we, as representatives of the American people, are committed to conducting military operations with oversight and accountability. Now, it accomplishes this, Mr. President, by requiring a joint resolution of extension to renew future AUMFs each Congress. Under this process, Congress may choose to let an AUMF expire or renew it under a joint resolution of extension with expedited procedures. This is a fast-tracked process requiring only a simple majority in the Senate, designed to make AUMF renewals as easy and seamless as possible so as not to hinder military planning. My amendment gives Congress the ability to review and reevaluate our involvement in wars and adjust them, if necessary, to better meet the specific objectives of the conflict or engagement. This flexibility and agility is nearly impossible under the current system, which has opened the door for overly broad applications and interpretations of existing AUMFs, sometimes past decades before the moment of a particular conflict or engagement, which in turn leads to endless wars. It would be a way for Congress to rein in this abuse without hindering our ability to adequately respond to present-day national security threats. Now, some have argued that we don't enter into wars to withdraw. When we must fight, we must win. But this argument has it exactly backwards. What could be stronger than a Senate resolution reaffirming our commitment to a given conflict? And given that every member of the House of Representatives is up for re-election every 2 years, 1/3 of the members of this body in the Senate are up for re-election every 2 years, we resolve some of the uncertainty that our partners and our adversaries might see, might fear, might wonder about, if in fact we're not regularly renewing each AUMF in each Congress. Mr. President, this is about accountability to the public. It's about the Republican form of government as a whole. It's about restoring Congress's Article I authority to declare war and authorize the use of military force. Let us do what we were elected to do. Ensure that all Americans have a voice in matters of great importance, especially when it comes to matters of war and peace, and that no president has the power historically reserved for monarchs, despots, and tyrants. I implore my colleagues to pass this amendment and thus restore the balance of powers mandated by the United States Constitution. Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 22 and ask that it be reported by number.
Clerk will report by number.
The senator from Utah, Mr. Lee, proposes an amendment number 22.
Madam President.
The senator from Utah.
Madam President, I'd like to talk about fentanyl. It's cheap, it's highly addictive, and it's deadly. It's responsible for more overdose deaths in America than any other drug. 110,000 Americans died from fentanyl poisoning last year alone in America. I recently joined a U.S. delegation to Mexico focused on stopping illicit drug trafficking, curbing illegal immigration at the U.S.-Mexico border, and addressing China's role in providing precursor chemicals for fentanyl production and laundering money for the cartels. I can say that the drug crisis spilling into our country is apparent to anyone willing to travel to the border and witness it for themselves. It's becoming more and more apparent every day. In fact, it's becoming more apparent even within Mexico. During my recent visit with President Lopez Obrador in Mexico, I heard him talk about the fact that although in many instances with many other drugs, U.S. Drug production in Mexico has often been sending drugs just to the United States, at least far more than it has to Mexico. But with fentanyl, they're seeing something different. They're seeing that fentanyl is now spilling into the Mexican market, and that many Mexican citizens are starting to die from fentanyl poisoning. So he, too, is concerned about it, is looking for ways that he can make sure that China keeps closer track of the precursor chemicals, and that the government of Mexico is notified when those shipments of large-scale containers of these precursor chemicals arrives in Mexico, presumably for the production of fentanyl inside of Mexico. Yet, notwithstanding all these developments, and 110,000 Americans dying in the last year alone from fentanyl, the Biden administration has utterly failed to stop this massive influx of fentanyl flowing across our southern border. In fact, fentanyl is one of the only commodities to see a price decrease since Biden took office. We've seen rampant inflation everywhere else, not with fentanyl. So despite this historic inflation that we've been experiencing ever since January 21st, 2021, street prices for this deadly drug have fallen, indicating supply is meeting demand without significant impediment, bringing down the price. For example, in Arizona, users were paying $20 per pill in early 2021, but by early 2022, the price had plummeted to $5. In Ohio, the cost of fentanyl went from $75,000 per kilogram in 2017 to $50,000 in 2019, and then to $36,000 in 2021. This, Madam President, is the last of the places where we want to see the opposite of inflation. We wish that our consumer products at grocery stores and everywhere else were going down, not the price of illegal, deadly fentanyl. Now, to put these numbers in perspective, we've been talking about the price per kilo. You know, $75,000 per kilo a few years ago, then $50,000 in 2019, then $36,000 in 2021. To put it in perspective, each of those kilos, just 1 kilo of fentanyl, contains 500,000 lethal doses. That is to say that 1 kilogram could wipe out the entire city of Atlanta, Georgia. 1 kilo could essentially wipe out the entire population of the state of Wyoming. 2 kilos could kill the entire state of Delaware. Now, the DEA recently announced the seizure of more than 50 million fentanyl-laced pills and more than 10,000 pounds of fentanyl powder just in 2022 alone. These seizures, no doubt, just represent a fraction of all fentanyl that made its way into the United States without detection and seizure, represented a staggering 379 million lethal doses, far more than enough to kill every man, every woman, and every child in the United States. Madam President, fentanyl is a killer. It's more powerful than morphine, and it has a potency that's measured in micrograms. Even a tiny amount can be lethal. Just 2 kilograms can kill an adult. Just 2 milligrams can kill an adult. And that's why when you measure this out, 2 milligrams or 2,000 micrograms going into a kilogram, that's going to get you to 500,000 lethal doses in 1 kilo. It's just unconscionable for this administration to turn a blind eye to the problem of fentanyl trafficking across the border. In the face of such a lethal threat, we need to have bold and decisive action, not empty rhetoric. Because the drug cartels really don't care about party politics. They only care about making money, and that money is coming from the pockets of our fellow Americans suffering from addiction. This isn't just a problem for border states like Texas and Arizona. It's a threat to every community in America. It's sold on street corners, in small towns, and in big cities. It's killing our friends, our neighbors, and our loved ones. Madam President, we must secure our borders to disrupt the drug cartels. We cannot tacitly allow fentanyl and other deadly drugs to continue flowing into our communities and destroying the lives of our everyday citizens. Now, yes, it's true. They are working to seize this stuff, and our law enforcement agents have seized a lot of it. But with millions of people crossing into our border, our southern border, over the last slightly more than 2 years, millions of people pouring in, that is making it worse, especially when you consider that those same people are being trafficked into the United States, earning billions of dollars, the extortionate rates that they charge to smuggle human traffic into the United States. It would be folly to assume, as the Secretary of Homeland Security recently suggested in a hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, that doesn't play a very significant role in fentanyl making its way into the United States. He insisted that nearly all of the fentanyl comes in by way of vehicles, trucks and passenger vehicles at points of entry. I don't know how he can possibly know that. In fact, it is impossible that he could know that, because when you've got 5 million people coming into the United States illegally through our southern border in slightly more than 2 years, it would be folly to assume that those people being trafficked by the drug traffickers wouldn't also be used to carry fentanyl. In short, Madam President, every pill of fentanyl is a potential killer. Every shipment of fentanyl is a ticking time bomb, if not a weapon of mass destruction. And every life lost to fentanyl is a tragedy. We owe it to ourselves, our families, and our communities to tackle this problem and to do everything in our power to stamp out the scourge of this drug in American communities. Thank you, Madam President. And today I rise to speak in opposition to the nomination of Nancy Abudu to serve on the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Ms. Abudu may well be the most radical judicial nominee nominated to date by President Biden. I've had concerns with Ms. Abudu's radical views and her apparent lack of respect for the rules of the court ever since her nomination. Then during our confirmation hearing, I asked her about allegations of potential judge shopping raised by Judge Burke of the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Alabama in a series of cases brought by the Southern Poverty Law Center. As a result of troubling attorney conduct in this series of cases, the 3 federal district courts in Alabama took the extraordinary and joint measure of convening to hear concerns raised by Judge Burke that Ms. Abudu's litigation team and their co-counsel brazenly abused judicial process. Ms. Abudu is, to be clear, the Director of Strategic Litigation for the Southern Poverty Law Center. And strategic litigation, is what they do. That's what they're about, and it's the director of this division. Now, when I asked her about her strategic litigation decisions in this series of cases, she stated, quote, "As Director of Strategic Litigation, my responsibility is to oversee and provide general management for our cases. But it is the subject matter experts in the litigation team that handle the day-to-day, including the filing of complaints, the briefing, and any oral arguments," close quote. In response to my question, she refused to be forthright. She didn't deny her oversight of these cases. She simply refused to admit that she was responsible for the strategic decisions that the 3 Alabama federal district courts found so troubling. Her lack of candor and her apparent disregard for the protections built into our legal system disqualify her for a position on the United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. As I asked her about these cases, pointing out only that the day-to-day litigation management was handled by other attorneys, which was obvious, she was openly, directly avoiding a direct line of inquiry, a line of inquiry that was very relevant to her nomination, to her confirmation process. But unfortunately, my concerns with Ms. Abudu's nomination do not end, and they didn't begin with this troubling series of cases that I've just described. You see, the attorneys general in every single state of the 11th Circuit, who were joined, by the way, by the attorneys general of a number of other states, but every single attorney general serving within the 11th Circuit was part of this letter, articulating concerns and confirming that there are grave dangers in confirming Ms. Abudu to the 11th Circuit. These attorney general, along with attorneys general from 15 additional states, including my home state of Utah, recently sent a letter to the leadership of this body expressing their numerous concerns with Ms. Abudu's nomination. The attorneys general of the people who would be subject to coming before Ms. Abudu in federal cases are justifiably worried about her potential confirmation today. These are people who really need to be able to have the confidence that when appearing before Judge Abudu, that she'll not only respect the law, but that she'll handle their cases without any preconceived biases that could lead her off course as she administers justice in her courtroom. If anyone has preconceived notions, biases regarding how justice ought to be administered, such that litigants could come to the conclusion that they won't get a fair shake in front of that judge, not to mention the preconceived prejudices against the good people living in the 11th Circuit, Ms. Abudu has certainly demonstrated that she does. Ms. Abudu is a longtime and current member and past leader of an entity called the National Lawyers Guild. Now, this group identifies itself as consisting of a radical movement of legal activists. Their words, not mine. After violent protests against Atlanta police officers, the National Lawyers Guild declared, quote, "Policing is the true threat to our collective safety." Imagine that. It's not crime. It's not other problems that police deal with. It's the police themselves. Policing, the act of policing. They didn't say specific police officers who may, unlike most officers, not be doing their jobs right. They said policing. Policing is itself the true threat to our collective safety. Imagine that. Now, I agree with these attorneys general that Ms. Abudu's longstanding and ongoing association with this radical anti-police group is alone ground for refusing and rejecting her nomination. I find it very troubling indeed that those who would be subject having to come before Ms. Abudu, find her track record dishonest and divisive. Let me quote from the letter outlining their concerns. Quote, "We are familiar with Ms. Abudu's work and her willingness to demonize those with whom she disagrees, and we know the importance of the seat on the 11th Circuit that she would fill. Ms. Abudu has proven herself unfit for that role. She's compared her fellow Americans to Jim Crow-era racists. She has aligned herself with self-proclaimed radical movement legal activists who view policing as the true threat to our collective safety." And the quote continues, "And she has proclaimed that our criminal justice system is practically the same system as during slavery. These spurious and outrageous statements vividly demonstrate that she lacks the judgment, fair-mindedness, and integrity required of a federal judge." Close quote. Now, to be clear, Ms. Abudu chose to associate herself with the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is itself well known for leveling unfounded charges of hate against any person or any group with which that organization happens to disagree. She became a leader in that organization and fully embraced its deplorable tactics, which are not intended to foster debate and understanding, but rather to silence opposition. They're well known for publishing things. Their hate list has brought about hate, led to a shooting in Washington, D.C. of an entity here. Someone got shot after believing that the Southern Poverty Law Center had indicated that that was the appropriate action. She's made offensive and baseless assertions against the people in the 11th Circuit. Now, I'm going to quote some more from the Attorney General letter. Quote, "Since becoming a leader of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Ms. Abudu has engaged in the deplorable tactics beloved by that organization by disparaging those in her way, including each of the 3 states within the jurisdiction of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. For example, she and her team submitted a report to Congress about Alabama's supposed unyielding record of racial discrimination in voting. The Alabama Attorney General's office set the record straight in a follow-up report that went claim by claim, documenting the SPLC's many misrepresentations. The quote continues, quote, "Each misrepresentation served the overarching theme of Ms. Abudu's report, that any disagreement over policy is proof that her political opponents are evil. Indeed, according to Ms. Abudu, things in Alabama are the same or worse today than they were in 1965. As she tells it, Alabama's goal today is to, and now these are her words, establish white supremacy in this state." The letter continues, "While some might see room for a good faith debate, for example, about the merits of Alabama's voter identification law, which was upheld by the 11th Circuit, the court on which she's been nominated to serve, Ms. Abudu sees only a relentless commitment to finding new ways to keep Alabamians from making their voices heard, all part of a desperate attempt to perpetuate majority white control." Her words, not mine. The letter concludes, "These assertions are as offensive as they are baseless, and they are disqualifying for an aspiring federal judge." To quote one more time from the letter, another part of the letter says, quote, "Though Ms. Abudu is surely aware of the facts, she prefers to use her powerful position at the Southern Poverty Law Center to sow division and erode trust among Americans, declaring that Jim Crow is still alive and well in the South. But as the Supreme Court has recognized, and as any fair-minded person knows, things have changed in the South. Ms. Abudu's contrary contention doesn't show simply professional disagreement. It shows, at best, insuperable bias. It more likely shows dishonesty, and it certainly shows unfitness for judicial office." I ask, by the way, the unanimous consent to submit and enter into the record the letter from these attorneys general.
Without objection.
She's shown marked hostility toward Alabamians, Floridians, and Georgians. She's accused them of suppressing minorities and poor people from voting. She's accused their police officers of targeting minorities. And all throughout her accusations is the thread of racism. It animates her every action, her every assault, her every view. She accuses Georgia of being, quote, committed to keeping us in the past, and that is scary, close quote. As the attorneys general appropriately ask, how could Ms. Abudu impartially adjudicate the many 11th Circuit cases involving Georgia, its statutes, its citizens, and especially its law enforcement officers, when she already believes the state is a bad actor, with a culture of law enforcement that targets black and brown people? There again, they're quoting her words. Ms. Abudu's record of hostility towards the people and the laws of the 11th Circuit is nothing short of alarming. When you combine that hostility with her lack of respect for the judicial system and her ongoing commitment to a group of self-described radical movement legal activists, I simply don't know how any member of this body can still believe she will serve the people of the 11th Circuit, or even less, our judicial system well. Look, the only way one can justify voting for this nominee is if one agrees with her hostile views and is comfortable with her activist approach. I am not, and I oppose her nomination in the strongest possible terms. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator from Wisconsin.
Mr. President, I know of no further debate.
Is there further debate? Hearing none.
Objection.
Madam President, $32 trillion. It's a colossal sum burdening every single American taxpayer. It's a tangible reflection of the prodigious debt accumulated over many decades of reckless spending. Now, the ramifications of our bloated national debt are far-reaching, felt in the daily lives of hardworking families crushed under the weight of relentless inflation. The prices of everyday necessities continue to rise, eroding purchasing power and placing an intolerable burden on the shoulders of every American family. A staggering figure ought to jolt us from our complacency, send shivers down our spines, and compel us to confront the dire consequences of Congress's longstanding recklessness when it comes to fiscal matters. Amidst the gravity of our nation's current predicament, we find ourselves standing at a precipice, a pivotal moment where our choices today will inevitably shape our economic outlook tomorrow and for years and, in fact, decades to come. The burden of our national debt and the relentless grip of inflation have placed us at this critical juncture, demanding nothing less than a resolute and visionary response. Regrettably, the lopsidedly negotiated Fiscal Responsibility Act, as it's called, heralded by Speaker McCarthy and President Biden, fails to provide the respite our nation desperately needs. Rather than offering substantive solutions to tackle the root causes of our fiscal woes, it appears to be a palliative pill. It's a bad deal for America, a missed opportunity to confront our challenges, an abdication of our responsibility to protect Americans' economic security and well-being. We can and must do better, Madam President. We must abandon the complacency that's brought us to this point and chart a new course, a course that values something approaching fiscal sanity. We can no longer afford to settle for half measures or short-term fixes. We desperately need a comprehensive and responsible plan, one that addresses the root causes of our fiscal predicament, curtails the bloated bureaucracy, and empowers American families once again to thrive. It's time to go back to the drawing board. Failure to do so, and to do so right now at this very moment, is to ignore the lessons of history. Nations that neglect their fiscal health often face economic calamity and social upheaval as a result. We're obligated to ourselves and to future generations of Americans to break free from this cycle of debt and inflation and forge a path of prosperity and sustainability. I talk about it in terms of the cycle of inflation and debt because the two go hand in hand. We cause inflation when we spend more than we have and spend more than we should. That makes every dollar that Americans earn, save, or have previously saved purchase less. And so, Madam President, I must express my profound disappointment over the Orwellian-named Fiscal Responsibility Act. In harsh juxtaposition to the Limit, Save, Grow Act, the ambitious plan by the House of Representatives, the meager offerings of the Biden-McCarthy deal are profound. First, House GOP leadership proclaims that the Fiscal Responsibility Act will save $1.5 trillion over a 10-year period through the two-year caps deal. But see, Madam President, therein lies the deception. The supposed savings are largely, in fact, almost entirely, illusory. The bill contains a mandatory two-year caps deal for the discretionary spending. But in reality, the spending limits for the other 4 years, the out years, are unenforceable and easily waived, in fact, easily ignored. It's a shell game of sorts, a carefully orchestrated act to create the false illusion of savings. But history has shown us that no caps deal has ever been fully enforced against future appropriations. The most recent and relevant example of this may well be Congress and its decision in the Budget Control Act of 2011 to impose these statutory caps on discretionary spending and then to raise those caps on 4 separate occasions in a bipartisan fashion over the decade that followed the adoption of those caps, completely negating the stated purpose of that bill. And unlike the BCA's 10-year statutory caps, all of which were in fact statutory, the FRA has only 2 years, which can be maneuvered around themselves. Just 2 years of statutory caps. That's all. You can get around those too. It's just a little bit harder. But after those first 2 years, it's not even a difficult thing because these aren't statutory caps at this point. It's a largely symbolic and ultimately feckless gesture. And yet, House leadership wants us in the Senate to rubber stamp a mammoth increase of $4 trillion in new debt in exchange for supposedly $1.5 trillion of claimed deficit reduction. The vast majority, in fact, the overwhelming share of which will never be realized. I'm confident stating that, predicting it right now. This is a pipe dream, and they know it. And what did they demand in return for raising the debt ceiling effectively by $4 trillion? What did they extract to ensure that this colossal sum once borrowed wouldn't go unchecked? Well, a meager $12 billion. A drop in the ocean compared to our nation's monumental burden. And that's a best-case scenario, considering that rather than raising the debt ceiling by a specific amount, which I think is the right way to do this, and the way that Congress has usually done this in the past, the deal raises it. It suspends the debt ceiling altogether through January 1st, 2025. It grants the Treasury authority to issue debt without any numerical limit to restrain its appetite. It's a carte blanche, a blank check of sorts for the government to spend, to borrow more money without accountability. This deal begs the question, with Republicans like these, who needs Democrats? We deserve better. We deserve a deal that genuinely reflects the urgency of our economic challenges and delivers meaningful results. To grant such a colossal debt ceiling increase while settling for a mere $12 billion in immediate savings is also an act of fiscal irresponsibility and betrayal of the trust placed in us by those who elected us. Equally disheartening is the state of work requirements within the deal. These work requirements were supposed to be part of the deal and a meaningful change in the law that was supposed to help things get better, help us not spend as much money, help people get out of poverty, help make sure that we don't have to come back to the well just 18 months or so from now and raise the debt ceiling yet again. Limit, Save, Grow championed a robust approach, acknowledging the importance of promoting self-sufficiency through work requirements. In contrast, this swamp deal that we're actually facing, it offers only token requirements, riddled with exemptions and gradual phase-outs. It's a farce of sorts, a charade that perpetuates the vicious cycle of entitlement, leaving countless Americans trapped in the clutches of dependency. Limit, Save, Grow had significant work requirements for TANF, food stamps, and for Medicaid. This bill strips the Medicaid work requirements altogether. With respect to TANF, it arguably doesn't do much at all, if anything, with respect to food stamps. According to some figures that we're studying from CBO, this arguably costs more money than it saves. In matters of fiscal prudence, Limit, Save, Grow stood firm in its determination to repeal the Democrats' $1.2 trillion Inflation Reduction Act. Talk about Orwellian names. That's one for you. Yet, in its lamentable capitulation, the McCarthy-Biden deal preserves every cent of the Inflation Reduction Act, leaving our nation mired in a quagmire of unsustainable and expensive policies that have done anything but reduce inflation. In fact, when you go throwing around in trillion-dollar increments that you don't have, that's what it does cause, is more inflation, and that's indeed what it has caused. Now, the consequences of this surrender in this bill are grave. If enacted, this bill would grant President Biden everything without meaningful safeguards or provisions to address the pressing issues. While it may be hailed as some sort of triumph of bipartisanship, the American people will ultimately bear the brunt of its shortcomings. You see, not everything that is bipartisan is, in fact, in the interests of the American people. Bipartisanship and compromise are an inevitability in anything that moves through the United States Congress. Some works to the benefit of the American people, but when members, a small handful of members of Congress, get together and decide what will be easiest for them, what will work best for them, what will make them look the best, without due regard to how it will impact the American people, that, Madam President, is not compromise. That's better described as collusion. Look, it's the American people who will bear the brunt of this bill with the implementation of President Biden's $500 billion student loan plan, a plan which now stands as a testament to President Biden's misplaced priorities, a millstone around the neck of hardworking individuals who will never benefit from such largesse. It's a stark reminder that while the government claims to champion the cause of equality and opportunity, it's very often the very policies it enacts that perpetuate inequality and hinder genuine progress. The hardworking veterans, the diligent plumbers, the countless others made to shoulder the weight of others' degrees, often degrees of people who now earn a whole lot of money, while relegating their own aspirations and dreams to the sidelines. It's a profound injustice when we shift the burden of personal choices and individual responsibilities onto those who have already toiled and sacrificed. That's what we're voting for with this bill. We're saying that it's okay to force those who labor in essential trades to bear the financial burden of others' educational pursuits. This is a patently unfair and bold-faced patronage racket, and like all good rackets, you need your strong-armed collector, and this administration found theirs in the IRS. The egregious expansion of the IRS is epitomized by the Democrats' allocation of $80 billion to this bloated agency with a demonstrated history of unethical targeting of conservative nonprofits, among others. The compromise reached between Biden and McCarthy, which retains 98% of the IRS expansion, 98%, is nothing short of a surrender, an anticipatory capitulation, of course. of sorts. It's a thing that is going to cause more problems. And so, armed with a hefty budget and a woke agenda, the IRS will become an even stronger instrument of political bias and partisan manipulation. The merging of ideology and bureaucracy poses a grave threat to the fabric of our republic, eroding the trust and confidence that should underpin our tax system. It might be true that this bill attempts to claw back some of the unspent COVID funds and the CDC global health funding. But while they point to rescinding roughly $28 billion in unspent COVID funds, we must acknowledge that much of that will merely offset spending increases elsewhere. This deal falls woefully short, failing to seize this opportunity to maximize the potential of these unutilized resources. Perhaps the cherry on top of this deal from hell is the glaring omission of an essential regulatory reform measure called the REINS Act. The REINS Act is a proposal. It's an acronym, stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny. Limit, Save, Grow, the debt ceiling bill passed by the House about a month ago, incorporated the REINS Act, which seeks to ensure that every major regulation put forth by a federal agency has to pass through congressional scrutiny. It has to be affirmatively enacted by Congress. This is already required by the Constitution, the very first operative provision of the Constitution, the first clause of the first section of the first article. Says all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. Legislative powers are the power to make law. Article 1, Section 7 makes clear that this is the only path to do it. Article 1, Section 7 reiterates and builds upon the legislative powers clause of Article 1, Section 1 by saying that in order to pass a law, a federal law, any federal law must become law only after it's been passed by the House and by the Senate and presented to the President for signature, veto, or acquiescence. You cannot make a federal law otherwise. Executive branch agencies have been getting around this for a long time with the assistance, sadly, of Congress, as Congress has delegated increasingly lawmaking power to unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, people who don't work for the American people, who can't be fired by them. This is a big problem. Now, look, Limit, Save, Grow incorporated the REINS Act, and that would have done a lot of good by subjecting this lawmaking power to elected lawmakers, to give them, us, the people elected to make laws, the final say. We were finally going to close that loop and say that agencies can write laws. They can write laws that will be considered proposed bills, bill proposals within Congress, but only Congress can enact them. Their laws made by the unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats who have no constitutional lawmaking authority, would not, under the REINS Act, be self-executing. Congress would have to be the lawmaker, as the Constitution already makes clear. The REINS Act really is about so much more than regulatory reform. It's about accountability to the public, the same kind of accountability that was envisioned by the Founding Fathers when they wrote Article 1, Section 1 and Article 1, Section 7. It's about the Republican form of government as a whole. It's about representative government, about people through the democratic process being able to elect those who will create laws to which they will become subject. It's about the American people being put adequately on notice as to what their legal responsibilities and obligations are. James Madison, in Federalist Number 62, spoke somewhat presciently when he wrote, quote, "It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood, if they be repealed or revised before they are promulgated, or undergo such incessant changes that no man who knows what the law is today can guess what it will be tomorrow," close quote. We are now suffering through a circumstance where not only are our laws so voluminous, complex, and ever-changing that we can't read them and understand what they require of us, but they weren't even written by men and women of our own choosing. This is wrong. This is as big of a miscarriage of justice as exists in this country. This is unreviewable legislative discretion of the sort that has historically been reserved for despots and tyrants. Despotism and tyranny, to this degree, in this unique way, exist in America today in our executive branch agencies. Limit, Save, Grow was going to address this through the REINS Act. Sadly, that provision was removed from this measure. Now, the cited excuse for this glaring exclusion, something that was really important to Republicans, should be really important to Republicans and Democrats and everyone else, is that the deal imposes an administrative pay-as-you-go provision, or pay-go as it's known. However, this is easily waived. It's bereft of any significant congressional role in the regulatory process. Let's not be naive to the realities of implementation. This process will be artfully manipulated in the hands of the Biden-appointed director of the Office of Management and Budget. The bureaucrats, the masters of their bureaucratic chicanery, will exploit every nook and cranny of the legislation, every nook and cranny, to generate fake direct savings. The noble intentions behind this provision will be buried beneath a mountain of smoke and mirrors. So when you read Section 263 of the Biden-McCarthy deal, you'll see this regulatory pay-go measure. But if you keep reading and you get to Section 265, you see that Section 265 destroys it. It takes it away. It effectively nullifies it. A restriction on a government actor that is then, in a subsequent section, 265, given the power to exempt herself from that restriction, is nothing at all. See, within the fine print of that loophole in Section 265 is language that renders the entire endeavor of regulatory pay-as-you-go completely toothless. The OMB director possesses complete waiver authority. If she deems it, quote, necessary for program delivery, then she can circumvent the provisions that purport to rein in the excesses of the bureaucratic machinery under Section 263. This is akin to placing the fox in charge of the henhouse and then granting the fox discretion to determine when the rules apply and when they can be conveniently cast aside. If the fox wants to consume the hen, the fox will, if the fox deems it necessary and appropriate. Don't believe me? Well, it didn't take long yesterday for the OMB director to say the quiet part out loud. When asked about the pay-go waiver authority included in the Biden-McCarthy deal, OMB Director Shalonda Young said, quote, if that waiver is deemed necessary to make sure President Biden's agenda is carried forward, we're going to use that authority, close quote. Translation, this means one thing. The regulatory pay-go measure means nothing. It is worth no more than the paper it's printed on. Less than that, in fact. Nothing. It does nothing. So if you're tempted to vote for this, perhaps taking some comfort in the idea that this is going to rein in regulatory excesses, please look elsewhere for comfort. It does not exist here. What irks me is not just that the REINS Act measure was removed. That's plenty irksome in and of itself. It shouldn't have been removed. We should have insisted that it be in there. And if some objected to it, we should have at least insisted that it be in there for as long as this debt ceiling issuance Mardi Gras remains in effect. It should be there. But if you're going to take that out and replace it with a regulatory pay-go measure, don't claim that it's real when in fact it's fake. This is appalling. With Republicans like these, who needs Democrats? Look, they're not even pretending to negotiate in good faith. In fact, while Republicans claim that this is a big victory for Republicans, meanwhile, the Democrats are doing everything they can to hide their excitement over this deal. Representative Jamal Bowman, a Democrat from New York, member of the House of Representatives, who's listed as undecided, but he said President Biden, quote, kicked McCarthy's butt, close quote. Fair point. He did. Madam President, in contemplating the magnitude, the sheer weight, and volume, and mass of our national debt, a colossal sum of $32 trillion. $32 trillion that will soon escalate to $36 trillion under this awful deal. One cannot help but be seized by a sense of awful foreboding. This staggering figure should serve as a haunting reminder of the consequences of our profligate ways, a testament to the grave irresponsibility that has permeated our political landscape for decades, far too long. Instead of confronting this existential threat head on, this deal is racked with complacency and false, cowardly compromise, placating the disconnected without addressing the root of the problem. It's the child of uncertainty, born out of a cowardly fear of confrontation, a lack of conviction, and it represents the victory of expediency over integrity. I cannot support it, and I will emphatically vote no, absent material changes that will render this bill something other than what it is, a fake response to burdensome debt. Thank you, Madam President.
Mr. President, this Saturday marks 1 year since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade at the urging of extremist politicians, upending 50 years of precedent protecting women's right to health care. In the year since that decision, half the states in our country have banned or effectively banned access to abortion. Women in those states have extremely limited options for getting the health care they need. Those who can't afford to travel have no choice but to go to other states to receive critical reproductive care. That's what happened to Lauren Hall. She and her husband were excited that she was pregnant for the first time, but then she learned that her fetus was developing without a skull, a condition that meant it wouldn't survive. This condition also increased Lauren's risk of hemorrhaging. Her doctors at home in Texas refused to help her terminate the pregnancy, so she had to travel to Seattle, where she was finally able to get the abortion care that she needed. She's currently suing the state of Texas for refusing to give her potentially life-saving medical care. Now, we knew that after the Dobbs decision, stories like Lauren's would only happen more often, and millions of women would lose the health care they need. Even before Roe fell, healthcare organizations in Nevada were prepared for an influx of women from out of state who needed abortion services. Justice Brett Kavanaugh recognized this too. In his concurring opinion, he indicated that women who have to leave their home state to get the care they need would be protected by the constitutional right to interstate travel. But we could see from miles away in Nevada that the far right would never stop plotting to roll back women's rights even further. In the last year alone, we've seen extremist Republicans try to stop women in our military from getting the health care they need. They've come after safe and effective birth control, and they've even supported a federal abortion ban to outlaw reproductive care in all 50 states. And now we're seeing far-right extremists actively work to bar women from seeking care in states outside their own. Now, let's be clear, this is about controlling women. The far right doesn't trust women to make their own health care decisions, so they think those decisions should be made by politicians instead. Well, I don't know about some of my colleagues across the aisle, but I don't think elected officials should be telling women what to do with their bodies. And neither do the vast majority of Nevadans. We are a proud pro-choice state. Back in 1990, Nevadans overwhelmingly voted to codify a woman's right to choose. And today, over 2/3 of Nevadans believe that a woman's health care decisions are between her and her doctor. And that's across all parties, Democrats, Republicans, and independents. But even though Nevada is a safe place for women who need health care, far-right Republicans living outside my state are telling women, oh, no, sorry, we're making it illegal for you to go there. This April, Idaho became the first state to make it a criminal offense for someone to help an individual travel out of state to seek an abortion. And elected officials in states like Tennessee, Texas, and Missouri are trying to punish women for leaving their state for reproductive care, as well as anyone who helps them, including their doctors or even their employers. This is why my colleagues and I are reintroducing the Freedom to Travel for Healthcare Act. 1 year after Roe versus Wade was overturned, we need this bill more than ever. Our legislation reaffirms that women have a fundamental right to interstate travel and makes crystal clear that states cannot prosecute women or anyone who helps them for going to another state to get the critical reproductive care that they need. We're talking about upholding a constitutional right to allow women to travel outside their home state. Now, why do some of my anti-choice colleagues want to restrict women from moving freely between states? The answer is simple. They don't trust women to have control over their own bodies. Well, I do. And I'm going to keep doing everything in my power to protect women, not just in Nevada, but in every state across the country. We must pass the Freedom to Travel for Healthcare Act. So, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-2053 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, there is an obsession on the left with abortion. It's becoming all-encompassing, infecting conversations that we have in the Senate on everything from the military to the Department of Veterans Affairs to phantom state laws that don't even exist. Look, judges have to bow their policy objectives if they want to be appointed in this administration, or those who are already on the bench, if they don't bow their policy objectives, if they don't bow to the abortion-centric, abortion-obsessed culture on the left, then all of a sudden they're going to face these baseless attacks to their credibility and even threats of violence. Now, this bill, properly understood, really should be called the Freedom to Traffic Act. You see, to my knowledge, no state, not a single state, has enacted a law restricting an adult's right to travel across state lines for purposes of an abortion or otherwise. I'm not even aware of a single state considering such a thing. And if a state were to even consider it, they wouldn't do it. And if they did do it, such a law would undoubtedly be struck down as unconstitutional on one of at least several grounds, including the fact that the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 of the Constitution has been interpreted by the Supreme Court, among other things, to prohibit any state from treating an article of commerce, including a good, a person, or thing, in interstate commerce differently based on its origin or destination out of state or outside the United States. States can't cabin their own residents or anyone inside their own state boundaries. That's well understood. So they don't have that authority. But more importantly, we're dealing with a phantom problem, a phantom law that does not exist. There's not a single state law out there that restricts an adult's right to travel out of state for an abortion or otherwise. Now, what some states do have, and perhaps that's what's causing the confusion here, are some laws to stop the trafficking of children across state lines to obtain an abortion without notifying their parents. Now, this is well established. We have laws on the books prohibiting the trafficking of minors across state lines with good reason. This is very different than what was implied as a reason why we need to pass this bill here today. And it just isn't true. Those laws don't exist. They are not on the books. They're not even being considered to be placed on the books. These laws are aimed to stop the sexual abuse of children by prohibiting their adult abusers and those in the abortion industry to help facilitate that abuse by transporting them across state lines for the purpose of obtaining an abortion and thus hiding the fact that they got an abortion from their parents. There are good reasons for these laws, Mr. President. In 2004, for example, the 14-year-old daughter of Marcia Carroll was taken by her boyfriend's family from their home in Pennsylvania, where they lived, to New Jersey. New Jersey, where parental consent for an abortion was not required at the time. There, once in New Jersey, they threatened to leave her in New Jersey unless she got an abortion, which she did, under duress, under coercion, afraid. The grief and devastation crushed this 14-year-old girl and her family, who had agreed to keep the baby. This so-called Freedom to Traffic Act would hamper the ability of states to punish such criminal and cowardly actions. I don't think there's anyone here who can defend that. Trafficking a child across state lines for purposes of obtaining an abortion. Now, sadly, this is not an isolated incident. Far from it. We know from undercover videos, from testimony from other courageous victims, and reports from former employees that Planned Parenthood actively works to hide these child sexual abuse instances, covering up for adult abusers by providing their child victims with abortions and failing to report abuse. This, again, is another thing that happens. Not only do we distort the facts, not only do we distort the status quo of the law in this country, but we also distort key facts when people become obsessed with abortion and they see abortion as if it were somehow an unmitigated good. Look, this bill was just barely introduced in the Senate, I believe as recently as yesterday. This bill has not been through any committee. It's not been marked up in the Committee of Jurisdiction, the Senate Judiciary Committee on which I serve. But Democrats think we should just pass it anyway. And I guess maybe they're channeling the now infamous words of former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, when she said, we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what's in it. This isn't how we legislate. And we certainly shouldn't be legislating when we haven't reviewed the bill, hasn't been through committee, we don't know what it says, and the bill's proponents are badly mischaracterizing what it does and why we need it. On that basis, I object.
Senator from Nevada.
Well, as we've already pointed out, the Constitution does protect the right to travel in this country, and there's no doubt that Supreme Court has made that precedent clear. But constitutional rights don't enforce themselves, and my colleagues on the far right only cloak themselves in the Constitution when it suits them, and right now it really doesn't suit them. That's why far-right Republicans in state legislatures across the country are working on and passing laws specifically focused on restricting a woman's right to travel for reproductive health care, something I noticed my colleague from Utah seemed to ignore, that Tennessee, Texas, Missouri are some of those states. And at the end of the day, let me just touch on this idea that somehow this legislation is focusing on trafficking of individuals for sexual exploitation. Now, again, this is a perfect example of some of the far-right Republicans, when they really can't argue the facts and the law of something, then they just make things up. Or they throw inflammatory arguments out there to try to scare individuals. But let me just make this clear. As a former Attorney General who works and continues to work on human trafficking issues that address the sexual exploitation of adults and minors, this is not trafficking. And I would say to my colleague in Utah, who knows better, that sexual exploitation of individuals this country needs to address, as long as many other countries, and we've passed laws to protect individuals. This is not it. What I do know is instead of addressing the true issue before us, which is why can't women be free to travel from a state that has restricted their right to abortion to my state, where we have chosen to allow them to get the health care they need, the essential health care. Now, it's always fascinating to me that I hear on the far right my colleagues say it's always about states' rights. It's about states' rights. This is a states' rights issue. Dobbs basically said in its decision, this is a states' rights issue. But then when it doesn't suit what they care about, the far right say, well, forget those states' rights. Only listen to what we as elected officials determine you should have. Ignore what Nevada has done. Ignore the Democrats, the Republicans, the independents, the men and the women in Nevada who chose to codify the right of a woman to choose and seek essential health care, and ignore that completely. That's what this legislation is about. It is about trusting women and giving them the ability to come to a state like Nevada to seek essential health care for their reproductive rights. And again, I constantly hear this emotional arguments about, and my colleague from Utah, who I respect, but he said this, the left somehow has an obsession with abortion. This is outrageous, outrageous inflammatory talk. What we do have an obsession with is freedom. And that every American in this country, whether you are a man or a woman, should have that freedom. And it shouldn't be taken away from you by elected officials who think they know better about your health care than you do, who think that they can restrict in their state your access to health care that could jeopardize your health care and your decisions about your family and your future because they think they know better. Mr. President, I just think it is outrageous that one simple thing that we cannot agree to in this Congress in a bipartisan way is that women should have that fundamental freedom to travel for their health care needs without being restricted, without being called names, without being fearful, and we should be protecting those doctors and the health care decisions to do it. I will say one final thing. We have worked hard in this country to evolve so that all our medical care is some of the best. We are fighting right now to make sure that we have access to technology, we have access to medical care, we do the research, we do the development. We have the medical care of the 21st century. And what my far-right Republicans are telling women across this country is you can't access that medical care for the 21st century. You know why? Because we think that we should hold you back to the 19th century. We want to politicize this, and we want to take away your rights, and so we are going to take you back to the 19th century. It is outrageous. Outrageous that we have to be here at this day and age. Over 50 years of Roe versus Wade, not one issue that we can see impeded anybody's rights here for women across this country and this fundamental freedom about reproductive rights. And so I am disappointed, but I will tell you what, Mr. President, this is an issue you are going to see all of us, one after another, continue to fight. This is an essential fight for women in this country and their rights and their freedom to choose. The freedom to choose and not have somebody else dictate what they should or shouldn't do with their bodies. Not to have somebody else dictate based on whatever their religion is or their rights, that they know better than somebody living in an issue that is so personal to them that they can be dictated to in this day and age. I yield the floor.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, it's important to point out that this legislation makes no distinction between those covered by it, whether they're children or adults. And that's my whole point, is that one of the problems with this is that it would block the effectiveness of state statutes that are there to protect children against interstate trafficking for the purpose of getting them abortions in another state without the knowledge or consent of their parents. And that's an issue. And yes, I do maintain I'm not aware of a single state law that prohibits a woman from traveling out of state, an adult woman from traveling out of state. If such a law exists, I'm not aware of it, and if it exists, despite my non-awareness of it, it's unenforceable. It would be deemed invalid instantaneously. You can't do that. But what this would do, since it makes no distinction between children and adults, is it would halt the operation of these state laws designed to protect children from interstate trafficking for the purpose of obtaining abortion, which is very often necessary in order to conceal child sex perpetrators and child traffickers in what they're doing. Now, my colleague and friend from Nevada, the distinguished senator from Nevada, referred to this, kept characterizing the far right. Now, to my knowledge, nearly every Republican in this chamber is pro-life. There's a few variations along the way, but nearly all of us are pro-life. Call all of us far right is excessive, and it's unfair. It's unfair especially because there's a mischaracterization also of why we believe what we believe. At least I can tell you what I believe about this. She refers to states' rights. I'd never call it that. Why? Well, because states don't have rights. States have authority. Authority is sort of the inverse polar opposite of a right. A right is something that you have that protects you from action by the state, by the government. Protects you from the authority of the collective coercive force that is government. So these aren't state rights, this is state authority. And that's really how we arrived here. That's really where we've been for the last half century. And while people are on the left bemoaning the deprivation of a right, I challenge each of them to tell me where in the Constitution it talks about abortion. And even though, of course, the word abortion doesn't appear in the Constitution, but what part of the Constitution actually confers that right? That's the problem that we're getting at here, and that's what I would like to address here for a moment. You see, because in Washington, it sometimes starts to feel like we're up against an immovable object, and where progress is measured in inches, and then victories are sparse and hard-fought, then occasionally the tides turn and something significant happens, and there's a seismic shift. 1 year ago, we experienced such a seismic shift when the Supreme Court issued its landmark decision in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. But to fully appreciate the significance of that historic moment and that decision, we must first understand the journey that got us to this point in the first place. So let's rewind the clock 50 years, all the way back to 1973, when the Supreme Court handed down its ruling in Roe versus Wade. A decision that, to say that it legalized abortion doesn't really capture the image. It centralized power in Washington, D.C. over abortion policy decisions. And then it kept that power not in the legislative branch of the federal government based in Washington, D.C., but across the street at the Supreme Court in 9 lawyers wearing black robes who have been sworn in as justices. By removing the American people's ability to make decisions through their duly elected lawmakers regarding abortion. It was a moment that completely reshaped the American people's ability to impact abortion policy. So for nearly 5 decades after that decision, this power to determine abortion policy rested ultimately with the Supreme Court. Sure, the Supreme Court would leave enough wiggle room to leave the impression that lawmakers, primarily at the state level, of course, could make law. But the Supreme Court was constantly inventing and reinventing what the standard was and what was not a permissible restriction on abortion. You see, this is what happens when you make up a non-existent constitutional right. When you just decide that something's really important, that you feel so strongly about it, that it must be in there. It's got to be in the Constitution because it's so important. When you take it away from the constitutional text, from the words of the document, all of a sudden you're left in this sort of no man's land where you have to make things up as you go along. The result was chaos. 49 and a half years of chaotic manipulation at will of the law. A state would do one thing, the Supreme Court would strike it down. Another state would do something slightly different, the Supreme Court would uphold it, sometimes changing standards along the way. But in Dobbs, the Supreme Court recognized the constitutional importance of keeping the power with the people, affirming that they have a legitimate interest in protecting the lives of the unborn and that they possess the authority to enact laws that reflect their values. You see, remember a moment ago when we talked about the difference between authority and rights. They're the opposite of each other. Rights protect you from authority. So when the Supreme Court decided as a matter of policy that it was so passionate about abortion in 1973 that it had to be in the Constitution, they effectively wrote it into the Constitution, even though it's not there. They made it utterly impossible for the people's elected representatives, either in their state legislative bodies, entities of local government, or where appropriate in Congress, to make most of the laws. Ultimately, those were all subject to the will and the whim and the caprice of the Supreme Court. They did that because they deemed it part of the Constitution. But when you just deem something a part of the Constitution, it doesn't make it part of the Constitution. I believe it was Abraham Lincoln who once asked rhetorically the question, if you call the tail of a dog a leg, how many legs does the dog have? He asked the question, someone answered 5, and he said, no, wrong, it's still 4. Just because you call the tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. The dog still has 4 legs. This still is the Constitution. There still is nothing in here that says, by the way, people can't make laws to protect the lives of the unborn unless the Supreme Court decides that they are permissible based on its own meandering standards, utterly untethered from the text of the Constitution or from 400 years of Anglo-American legal and jurisprudential tradition. So in Dobbs, they restored this power back to the people. In Dobbs, they reaffirmed the fundamental belief that every human life is sacred and every human life is deserving of protection. In Dobbs, the court recognized that decisions on deeply personal and morally significant matters should be made closest to the people that they affect. Unfortunately, in the wake of Roe, we've witnessed a really dark chapter in our nation's history. This decision wrongly declared that abortion was a right, despite no mention of it anywhere in the Constitution. The decision ushered in a new era, one that forced us to tolerate some of the most barbaric of practices. Late-term abortions, gruesome procedures that practically no American supports, became a stain on our society. Even as those cases were litigated, the gruesome procedures were described. Some of the most hardened lawyers could barely tolerate mentioning much or even listening to the words describing the procedures. But
President, would the senator yield for a question about how long he intends to speak, just for the convenience of others?
Sure. I anticipate I'll be finished within 5 minutes.
I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
But we refused to accept this as the new status quo. We knew that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. The Dobbs decision brought us a glimmer of hope. It reaffirmed the fundamental belief that every human life really is sacred and is deserving of protection and is capable of being protected within our constitutional system. Finally, we are empowered to exercise our constitutional prerogative and resume our efforts to protect the lives of the unborn and end these unspeakable horrors. And so this issue of states' rights, again, they're not states' rights. That's oxymoronic. We call it federalism, state authority. So this victory of Dobbs, it's not just a victory for state sovereign authority. It's also a victory for humanity. Because when we're told by the judicial branch of government, contrary to fact, that the Constitution tells us that we cannot, may not, must not protect unborn human life, that really does grave damage to humanity. The victory of Dobbs is a reminder that we can't afford to turn a blind eye to the moral and ethical implications of our laws. We must proceed in a way that protects the innocent and defend against the atrocities allowed under this lofty-sounding but ultimately barbaric platitude of choice. Even with this victory, we still have a long way to go. Contrary to the assertions of many on the Democratic side of the aisle, the Dobbs decision did not make abortion illegal. It did nothing of the sort. While many states have passed laws to protect preborn children, and I applaud them for doing so, others have expanded their abortion laws. Late-term and partial birth abortions are still a reality in many states. This isn't something that I celebrate. I disagree with those laws. But I don't live in those states. And the important thing is that the people in those states are making those laws. And most of the time it is in the states and not here in Congress where things not rendered federal by the Constitution should be decided. As we approach the one-year anniversary of Dobbs, I believe we're duty-bound to remember the millions upon millions of innocent lives lost, the pain and suffering endured, and the resilience of the men and women who fought for those who could not fight for themselves, who have no voice and therefore had to have others speak on their behalf. We should be inspired to build a society where life, every life, is cherished, where compassion triumphs over convenience and cowardice, and where the horrors of abortion become a distant memory, especially the horrors of abortion forced upon us by a judicial oligarchy utterly untethered from the text of the Constitution. The Dobbs decision represented a turning point, the moment when we said enough is enough. Now we're positioned to acknowledge that every life, from conception to natural birth, deserves our protection and our compassion and our care. And yes, in some states they're going to do that differently than in others. But the fact that they're going to do it differently in one state or another doesn't mean that they don't deserve protection. So as we celebrate this milestone, I hope we can remain committed to this cause. Let us never forget the horrors foisted upon us by Roe and the significance of the Dobbs decision in restoring sanity and compassion to the laws that guide our nation. Together we can forge our future, where the rights of the unborn are safeguarded, where the dignity of every human being is cherished, and where the dark days of the past remain only as reminders of our resolve to create a better world. In the face of adversity, remember that change is possible. Remember that we possess the ability to achieve great things. Our nation's health and strength lie in the people's hands, and together we can shape a future where every life is valued. Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 376 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
Senator from Utah, Mr. Lee, proposes an amendment numbered 376.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
My amendment, lead number 376, is a measure that drives accountability and fairness in supporting Ukraine. My amendment creatively incentivizes our NATO allied nations to shoulder their fair share of the security burden in securing Europe. This isn't about withholding funds from Ukraine. It's about encouraging allies to meet their 2% of GDP spending thresholds with regard to their national security. Within Congress, we respond to the call of duty by urging NATO allies to step up and to meet their obligations, obligations that they've made and obligations that, when they go unmet, result in the United States of America shouldering a disproportionate, unfair share of the burden. We've been doing this for years, just as we've provided and held a disproportionate share of the burden, specifically with regard to Ukraine. Now, let me be very clear. My amendment ensures that funds for Ukraine remain untouched while allies contribute their fair share. Europe's security is indeed a collective endeavor, and Lee 376 motivates our allies to meet or exceed the 2% pledge. But for it to be a collective endeavor, they've got to pay their way. They haven't been. This would incentivize them to do so. I urge its passage.
The senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, this amendment is, I think, reckless. It would essentially halt 98% of the aid that we would authorize and appropriate to go to Ukraine, which would be good news in Moscow, but very bad news in Kyiv. This amendment is trying to incentivize our NATO partners to increase their efforts to 2% of GDP, and that's a goal that has been agreed to. But the practical immediate effect would be to undermine the military posture of Ukrainians at a time when they are desperately fighting for their survival. But more importantly, they're fighting our fight also. Because if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, we will lose as well as the Ukrainians. It will incentivize the kind of autocratic behavior that is determined, at least in the case of Putin, to destroy democracies and destroy the international legal order. We have already expressed our not only desires, but strong imperatives that NATO reach their 2% goals. But this is punishing the Ukrainians for the sins of others, and that would be terrible. I would urge that this position be rejected.
Call for the yeas and nays.
Madam President, last Saturday, October the 7th, we saw evil personified. We saw the deadliest attack on the Jewish state since the Yom Kippur War. Over 1,400 dead Israelis. And for context, think of that, if that were America, it would be over 40,000 dead Americans. On top of that, Madam President, we've seen 30 Americans lose their lives because of the evil brought upon Israel. We saw Hamas, an evil terrorist organization, launch an unprecedented, unprovoked, undeniably devastating attack on the Jewish state. I can't think of anything more evil than the images that we saw coming out of Israel, where grandmothers were taken captive, where babies were burned alive, and where babies were beheaded. For what reason? For what reason did we see the atrocities and the evil brought upon a people? Simply because they were Jews. Hamas, their goal is to eliminate the Jewish state. But that's not where they stop. They want to annihilate every single Jewish person on the planet, with more than 6 million living here at home in America. But they go one step further. They despise Western democracy. They want the elimination, the annihilation of our entire way of life. Fighting that war with a single-minded focus is exactly what we should expect from the Jewish people, from the state of Israel, from the Prime Minister Netanyahu. He needs to have a single-minded focus. But that is not the case, because we have seen in the last 24 hours or so the emergence of a different kind of war that they now must fight. It is the war of misinformation. The disinformation, the misinformation war could be just as deadly, if not more deadly, than the actual attack we saw last Saturday, October the 7th. One might ask the question, why would I say that? Well, I would say that because immediately what we've seen since the devastation in Israel was Prime Minister Netanyahu sending the signal that they were coming into Gaza, giving people, Palestinians, a chance to find themselves out of harm's way. But the misinformation campaign takes a different turn, a different spin, a different direction. What it said was that the hospital strike was in fact carried out by Israel. That misinformation was carried in the New York Times, the AP, and other news outlets in America. That misinformation campaign caused a summit in Jordan to be canceled. It caused President Biden's meetings to be canceled. It caused protests at embassies around the globe. Our embassies around the world felt the devastation of misinformation, of lies signaling to the world that now Israel must fight a different kind of war at the exact same time that they have a proportional response, which is and should be wiping Hamas off the face of the map. We saw as a result of that misinformation war, Hezbollah mobilizing. We've seen very clearly an attempt to weaken Israel and their standing in the world. Devastation after devastation, and then on top of that, we see the emergence of another deadly counter. Rather than waiting for the facts, these outlets carried the Hamas narrative, carrying the narrative of an evil, lying, terrorist organization. And on top of that, equally as devastating is to see the divide within the House of Representatives, where the vast majority of Republicans and Democrats stand firm with our ally, Israel. But there are members in the squad who have decided to continue spreading the propaganda of Hamas. Congresswoman Tlaib has yet to delete the tweet that says, Israel just bombed the Baptist hospital, killing 500 Palestinians, doctors, children, patients, just like that. Delete the tweet. We cannot have members of the United States Congress sending out and being an extension of the Hamas propaganda machine. It is despicable behavior from elected representatives of the greatest nation on God's green earth. Those members did not start their anti-Semitic comments on October the 8th. This started months and even years prior. There is a cancer that is metastasizing on the radical extreme left that has to be dealt with in America. I've said several times over the past several days that Psalms 122:6 is so important, that we should pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and those who do will prosper. There is no doubt in my heart, there is no doubt in my mind that we find ourselves living in dangerous times in this world. Conflicts in Eastern Europe, now conflicts in the Middle East, and real threats in the Indo-Pacific. We need American mettle, we need American leadership, and we need it to be strong, defiant, clear, and undeniably the strongest force for good on the planet. It's one of the reasons why I made strong comments about the terrible decision, the unbelievable decision to release $6 billion for hostages. I said this during the Obama administration, that paying $400 million for hostages would make more Americans less safe abroad and raise the price on every head. And now, with $6 billion being paid to Iran, Iran being the chief funder of Hamas, after the attacks, Hamas thanks Iran for the help. We do not need an administration to be complicit with such challenging and evil attacks on the Jewish state. As one reason why I seek, Madam President, I seek consent to pass my legislation, the Solidify Iranian Sanctions Act. In 1996, we put in place sanctions on Iran. We did so in the sector of their energy sector because we understood that causing pain would be an important and necessary component of keeping Iran in its place to slow down, if not stop, the spread of terrorism. We had to act, and I'm thankful that in 1996 we did act. But that action is set to sunset. It is set to expire. We must keep those sanctions in place. Without any question. I look at the support for my legislation. This legislation predates the attacks on the nation of Israel. This bill has the support from both sides of the aisle. It is a common sense step to make permanent the Iran Sanctions Act of 1996, and support comes from both sides of the aisle, including the only Jewish mother in the Senate, Senator Rosen. This is one of many steps we must take to restrain this regime from developing weapons that threaten safety and security around the world. I believe that if we want to respond to this brutality, if we want to respond to this evil, one of the ways that we can respond is by making permanent the sanctions on Iran. I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S. 1390 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President,
The junior senator, or the senior senator from Utah.
Madam President, reserving the right to object, I appreciate the passion with which the senator from South Carolina has delivered his remarks today, and also grateful for his willingness to adopt a minor modification, a savings clause, clarifying that nothing in this legislation may be construed as independently authorizing the use of military force against Iran or any country. That's something we should do independently. So I'm grateful for the senator from South Carolina's willingness to work with me on that, and that he's agreed to do it. The junior senator from Kentucky, Senator Paul, has suffered a death in his family and is away today attending the funeral of that immediate family member. At his request, I'm here to object on his behalf, and on behalf of Senator Paul, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President, I am deeply disappointed that common sense seems to be harder to find in Washington, D.C. It's just not common enough. I certainly hope that we have an opportunity to see CISA, my bill, make permanent the sanctions against Iran. It is critically important that we show progress sidelining the largest state supporter of terrorism in the world.